The compensation intermediate event enables you to handle compensations. When used within the sequential flow of a process, they indicate that a compensation is necessary, i.e., a compensation is launched and the icon on the inside should be filled. When used on the borders of an activity, it indicates that this activity will be compensated when the event is triggered. The compensation activity that is associated to the event will be performed, and the icon on the inside should be left empty. This type of intermediate event is unique, because this event only works after the activity is complete, and it does not represent an exception handling, just a compensation. The link intermediate event is a type of event that allows you to connect two sections of the process. That is, acting as a connector between pages of the same process. As we have seen previously, we have 10 types of intermediate events in BPMN. None, message, timer, error, cancel, compensation, conditional, link, signal, and multiple. Each type of intermediate event will have a different icon placed in the center of the intermediate event shape to distinguish one from another. The intermediate event can catch the event trigger, or the intermediate event can be used to throw the event trigger. When the event is used to catch, the event marker will be unfilled, and when the event is used to throw, the event marker will be filled. Some intermediate events can be placed within the normal sequence flow of the process, can be used to catch an event trigger, or can be used to throw an event trigger. And some intermediate events can be attached to the boundary of an activity and can only be used to catch the event trigger. The most commonly used intermediate events are none, message, timer, and error. In the example, we can see an intermediate event that is called investigate, that when activated, launches a sub-process of investigation. In this case, it is diagrammed with an event that can or cannot occur within the process. The timer intermediate event can be used within the sequential flow, or joined to the borders of an activity. When it is found within the sequence flow of the process, it indicates a delay or waiting time. The time of the event can be a period of time, i.e. minutes, hours, days, etc., or it can be given as a specific date. In the example, we can see a timer intermediate event used within the sequential flow, indicating that the contact client activity is activated on the date agreed with the client. In this example, we can see a timer intermediate event joined to the borders of an activity, indicating that if the documents have not been received and annexed within 3 days, then an exception flow is activated, whereby it is followed up with the client. When it is used within the sequence flow of the process, it can be a reception event, waiting for a message to be received in order to continue the process flow, or it can be a send event, in which case a message is launched to another process. Remember that when the event is used to throw or send the message, the icon should be filled. In the process, we can see an example of a process that uses a message intermediate event to indicate that it should wait for a message from another process, whereby it indicates that the candidate for the vacant position has been selected. Additionally, during the hiring process, it is possible that the candidate will be rejected, in which case a message is sent to the selection process notifying the rejection. In this way, the search can continue. When the message intermediate event is used joined to the borders of an activity, this indicates that the activity will be aborted when the message is received, and the exception flow will be continued. In this case, the message intermediate event can only be of reception, In the example, we can see a process with a message intermediate event joined to the borders of an activity, indicating that if the message is received, the process will continue by the exception flow. The error intermediate event is only used on the boundaries of an activity, signifying the activity has aborted when an error message is caught. If the error intermediate event appears on the boundary of a service task, it is not necessary to have an event that throws the error, as this is implicit and it is understood that the service will respond with an error. In the example, we can see an error intermediate event on the boundary of the automatic activity that generates the purchase order. If the activity fails, the event will catch the error, and in this case, the purchase order will be produced manually. If the error intermediate event appears on the boundary of a sub-process, the error can be thrown from within the sub-process as an end error end event. In this example, we can see an error intermediate event on the boundary of the sub-process The cancel intermediate event, as with the cancel end event, is only used in transaction sub-processes. In this case, when the transaction is cancelled, the cancel intermediate event that is found on the boundary of the transaction sub-process and is in charge of routing the process to an exception flow. In the same example, we can also see within the sub-process some compensation events on the boundaries of some of the tasks. In this case, when the transaction process is cancelled, it is necessary that all the activities of the transaction revert to their initial state, and to do this, we use compensations. Therefore, when there is a cancel event, not only is the sub-process cancelled and the process continues via an exception flow, but also all the tasks within the sub-process that have a compensation intermediate event associated will be compensated. This compensation is performed in reverse order of the execution. Bear in mind that when compensation events are on the boundaries of an activity, they will always have a compensation task associated. Ensure that these compensation tasks do not have either an incoming or outgoing sequence flow. Simply indicate that an activity should compensate itself and that it is associated with the compensation intermediate event by means of a connection known as association, i.e., it does not use sequence flows, and in addition, the compensation will be only one task, not a compensation flow. Remember that associations are also used to connect data objects and annotations within the flow. The compensation intermediate event can also be used within the sequence flow, indicating that a compensation will be thrown, in which case the interior of the icon will be filled. When the compensation message is sent, all the activities that have a compensation intermediate event on their boundary will be compensated. That is to say that compensations are not only used in transaction sub-processes. It is important to bear in mind that for an activity to be compensated, it has to be performed and completed successfully. The difference between other intermediate events is that the activity that has a compensation associated should have been performed successfully to be able to be compensated. When we have a message, signal, timer, error, or condition intermediate event joined to the boundary of an activity so that the exception flow can be activated, it is necessary that the activity has not yet been completed, i.e., the event should be available and waiting to receive the event trigger, the message, signal, timeout, error, or condition. The signal intermediate event is used to send or receive signals. The difference between these and messages is that signals do not have a defined destination, nor are they solitary. A process can send the signal, and many processes can receive it. This can trigger many processes. Good. Now we are going to practice what we have learnt. For this diagram, the following exercise.